Hi, good morning and welcome to Accelerating the Energy Transition, the current webinar. In a series moving towards a coordinated approach. Today we'll be focusing on the 10E and European grid infrastructure. Next slide, please. Next slide. So firstly, a little bit about Current and who we are. So Current is an industry association, a relatively young one, and the companies here are members of Current. They're really innovative companies that are developing innovative technologies for networks, predominantly networks in electricity, DNOs for TSOs, and it's really around maximizing the use of the grid. Next slide, please. So our goal is to generate awareness of these new technologies. The grid has been around a long time. Technology innovation is happening all around us, and it's to bring that to bear and to bring these new solutions to the table, to influence policy, and that's to input to the development of new regulatory frameworks that will speed up the adoption of alternative proven solutions for the benefit of all Europeans, to enhance technology, to introduce where needed, and to support the trialing of those new technologies, and to engage in the ecosystem with TSOs, with DSOs, with policymakers through our association to stand up for principles of transparency and stakeholder interaction. So that's a little bit about Current. Next slide, please. The technologies that our members provide to utilities today are in the realm of hardware, software, and associated protocols. So we've got modular power flow control, which can change the behavior of networks, dynamic line rating, which can enhance the amount we can get from existing networks, and new technologies for tomorrow, superconducting cable systems, and today, innovative sensors. They're some of the technologies which we provide to TSOs and DSOs today. Next slide, please. Of course, Current responded to the 10E proposals earlier this year and put in our own response, which I won't go through with you. There's a summary of it at the end of this presentation. But I would like to introduce today, next slide please, our host and moderator, Pat Cox, who's a former president of the European Parliament itself. And I'll now hand over to Pat.
So thank you very much indeed, John, and good morning from Dublin, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our webinar. I think we'll get rid of the slide and I'll do a bit of talking and then maybe bring up a slide later on if we could. An especially warm welcome, of course, to our speakers, and thank you to our audience for joining us. Can we move the slide, please, and just put up, yeah, okay. Our theme today, as you've heard, is accelerating the energy transition and moving towards a coordinated approach, and specifically we're looking at 10E and the rollout of infrastructure. I should say, for the sake of transparency today, that I should declare an interest. I am a member of the board of SuperNode, which itself is a founder member of Current, our hosts today. However, my role as moderator will be to facilitate the discussion, not to engage in it. In terms of our proceedings, I intend to invite each speaker consecutively to take 5 minutes to introduce their key messages, and then we'll have a panel discussion. Our guests today are Raphael Sauter from the European Commission, DG Energy, European Parliament Shadow Rapporteur Erik Bergkvist, a member of the S&D group in the Parliament, Dimitrios Chaniotis, Senior Advisor RTE and Chairman of System Development Committee ENTSO-E, and John Fitzgerald, a board member of Current and CEO of SuperNode. On organisational matters, one final observation. As you can observe today, we don't regrettably have a gender balance on our panel, but I do want to point out to you that several female expert participants were invited, but none of those was free at this time today to actually attend. Let me just attempt a very brief scene setting for this morning. Speaking earlier this summer to the Dublin Climate Dialogues, which I had the privilege to chair, John Kerry, the US presidential climate envoy, observed, and I quote, that no government acting alone is going to solve the crisis itself. This is going to be the biggest economic transformation that any of us have seen. And so that is really the background to our discussion. And the timing, of course, is perfect because we're dealing with the question of 10E and our preparation for what will be this enormous economic and energy transformation. Please take a look at a slide now that sets out the background to today's seminar. The Commission made its 10E proposal in December 2020. The Council agreed its general approach and its common position before the summer on the 11th of June. The European Parliament is scheduled to vote in committee next week on the ITRE committee, and we're looking forward to learn what the state of play is at this time, making, of course, our event particularly timely. Moving on from the slides to the wider theme, the European Commission expects that 2/3 of the 800 billion of investments needed in offshore renewables will be for infrastructure and 1/3 for generation assets. It has proposed a regional approach to tap into the massive offshore renewable resources. And meanwhile, of course, we've had the publication of the new and ambitious Fit for 55 package tabled by the European Commission to provide legislative tools for Europe to meet the 55% greenhouse gas reduction target by 2030 and as a foundation to drive on to full decarbonisation by 2050. This, of course, will require climate laws and the adoption of legislation by the institutions in the coming years. And of course, as we contemplate a zero carbon future, right now, the realities of our energy market are weighing heavily on governments, businesses, and consumers. European, indeed global power prices are at an unprecedentedly high level due to a kind of perfect storm of events. We've had low wind speeds, we've had lower hydro due to low precipitation in Scandinavia, we've had a fire in a UK converter knocking out a UK-France interconnector, we've had lower gas imports from Russia, apparently due to maintenance issues, I wonder, and we have low European gas stocks. All of this combined with a post-peak COVID economic recovery. So there's a lot of urgency in the energy market today and a massive transformation at hand. And now to our speakers. It's my pleasure to give the floor first to Raphael Sauter of DG ENER.
Thank you very much, Pat, for the introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this webinar, which is indeed extremely timely, given that we should soon have the positions of both legislators on the Commission proposal that was presented in December 2020. And I would just quickly like to recall the key points, which also seem to be most relevant in the current ongoing discussions. I will quickly highlight again the objectives of our proposal and then focus on 2 points. One is the infrastructure categories, and the second one, the governance process in the 10E regulation. And for those less familiar with the 10E, what is 10E? It's about a framework that helps to identify projects of common interest, PCIs, meaning key energy infrastructure projects that are needed to achieve our EU energy and climate objectives. And I think there is a strong agreement on the ultimate objective of our 10E revision, which is to fully align the framework to the Green Deal objectives, the framework for cross-border infrastructure planning. Our evaluation, which was done before the proposal, showed we have an effective tool that helped to achieve our policy objectives to a large degree. We have nearly 50 PCIs completed and many ongoing to be completed in the near future. So now it's about ensuring that the revised 10E framework contributes to the 2030 and 2050 climate and energy targets and ultimately climate neutrality, whilst at the same time contributing to market integration, security of supply, and competitiveness. And now in the next slide, we can see on the first topic I mentioned on energy, on the energy infrastructure categories, how we propose to ensure that the framework is fully aligned with the Green Deal objectives. And it was already mentioned by Pat in the introduction. One key aspect is, of course, the offshore renewables developments and the required offshore grids to enable the development of 300 gigawatt of offshore renewables by 2050, as was enshrined in the offshore renewable strategy that was published also in 2020. And we have a new chapter in the revised 10E with specific provisions, including, for example, offshore one-stop shops for these projects to help their implementation, and also building on the regional cooperation approach to help the rollout of offshore grids. And I will come back in the next slide later on one specific point again on offshore. The second point here is smart electricity grids is an important part of the energy transition. And in the revised framework, we propose to clarify the provisions on smart electricity grids, update them to reflect developments on digitalization and cybersecurity. At the same time, while strengthening electricity, we do exclude fossil fuel infrastructure from the revised 10E, given that unabated natural gas will play lower role in the future, of course, but also given the success we've seen with the completion and ongoing implementation of PCIs to establish a shock resilient natural gas infrastructure in Europe to avoid problems we had in the past. And at the same time, introducing new infrastructure categories for renewable and low carbon gases, mainly dedicated hydrogen pipelines, and also electrolyzers with a threshold of 100 megawatt, which some say is ambitious, but we think this is in line with what we see ongoing at the moment and the objectives, but also to ensure the cross-border element, the cross-border dimension of these electrolyzers. And that's a point I would like to emphasize here, as I did in my first slide. 10E is a cross-border infrastructure planning tool in the first place. So we think it should cover cross-border infrastructure, and we should avoid expanding the framework to local project categories where we don't see a cross-border dimension. It's not to say that these projects are not important. They are very important for the local communities and for climate and energy objectives, but we don't think that the 10E framework is the right framework. And I think that's a very important point. And here the last point on that slide is another expansion of the scope, which is we introduced PMIs, projects of mutual interest, to accommodate projects with third countries in the revised framework, since these will be also more important in the future. Let me then move on to the next slide before I hand over to the next speaker. And this is the second important topic, I think very important topic, which is the governance framework in the 10E. And this is the process that leads to the selection of the PCIs. And here we also propose some changes building on the comments received in the stakeholder consultation process, but also looking at past experience. And here we propose a more integrated infrastructure planning approach, bringing the sectors better together in line of the energy system integration, and also to ensure that the scenarios that are used for the identification and assessment of the candidate PCIs are fully in line with the Union decarbonization targets and the Commission scenarios, and also to ensure that the infrastructure needs are identified based on the energy efficiency first principle. And in view of a more balanced approach, also in the role of the different actors involved in the PCI selection process, we do propose some changes to introduce a better oversight from the Commission to ensure that the points I mentioned in the first bullet are fully reflected in the process, but at the same time also strengthening the role of ACER, while keeping a clear line of responsibilities and also bearing in mind that it's a 2 years process. And what I think we've seen in some discussions is a risk of introducing elements in this process which may not, or which may be very difficult to actually implement in a 2 years framework. And also in terms of responsibilities, it may be less clear, but we may be able to discuss this later on. And then my last point, and I mentioned it earlier, is about the offshore developments, where we think it's a major need in the future in our framework. We do introduce so-called integrated offshore network development plans, which should be based or will be based or would be based on member state commitment. So the idea is that member states in a regional context per sea basin would first agree on how much capacity, offshore renewable capacity, we want to see by 2030, 40, and 50. And this to use as a starting point on how an integrated offshore network grid would need to look like, as a strategic document, which can be used by project promoters, investors to develop then specific projects. So it would move from a bottom-up approach as we have now to a top-down approach, a more strategic approach, which we think is needed to, or would greatly help to reach the 300 gigawatt of offshore renewable capacity I mentioned in the beginning. So these are the key points which I wanted to highlight in my introduction, and I'm looking forward to the discussion later on. Thank you.
Raphael, we thank you very much. That's a very clear presentation on aspects of the policy and on the governance, and I look forward to coming back to you on it. It's my pleasure now to introduce Erik Bergkvist. Erik is a shadow rapporteur on the 10E proposal. It is now at a very critical stage before the committee, and Erik, we're looking forward to learning from you what's happening in the Parliament and what should we expect. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this, I would say, very timely seminar. Last Tuesday morning around 3:30, we finished the negotiations with the rapporteur and the shadow rapporteurs, and I would say we had a basic and very broad agreement. Some days later, we also got from the groups that the basic agreement that we had is holding. So right now, and I'm unfortunately can't go into so much details, I would say we have a quite broad agreement. But for you who have read the Commission's suggestions, and I guess that's all of you listening to this, you wouldn't be that shocked and surprised, because we are, in many cases, we're quite close to the original suggestions from the Commission, and which I would say from my group, we thought were basically very, very good suggestions. I've also reflected a little during this work how important it is. Energy production and consumption is, I would say, the opposite side of the coin, and you have the climate change on the other side. It's basically what we do with the energy will, of course, affect how we will succeed by mitigating the climate change. I've also thought of how quickly things are moving. My grandparents, for example, they were farmers. They had 6 cows, a horse, no tractor. There was a tractor in the village. They had a wood stove. They had electricity, but they had no hot water, and the toilet facilities were outside where you kept the animals. And now, just 50 years later, this is almost unimaginable how people could have that standard all as long as in the 70s and the 80s. So things are really changing quickly. And I would say we had a really frank negotiations. We were quite wide apart. But I would say at the final stages, we found this, I would say, broad compromise. From my party group, and I would say that's also something that we encountered when we discussed the last PC list 4. A lot of people wanted to say, this is not good. It's too much fossil. I would say fossil gas, of course. So let's stick to number 3 and then demand a new number 4. But of course, with the same 10E regulations, you can't really expect any miracles. And I would say that's why PCI list 4 prevailed, at least, because it was better than PCI list 3 from this respect. So that has been a lot of attention, how to keep it fossil free. And if it's one thing we know, if we're going to manage the Green Deal, is that we will need a lot of electricity, we'll need a lot of fossil-free electricity. So that has been one of the main focus here, how to create that connection in Europe so that it can flow free, and also hydrogen, fossil-free hydrogen. And I would say we have all the topics Dimitrios mentioned have been, I would say, one of the major parts of the discussion. The offshore grid, the blending, hydrogen, carbon and capture, how to handle those kind of things, but also governance. Is this the best way to govern the 10E structure? We would like to have more transparency, and I would say also more coherency in this process. And we thought it was good that the Commission put Acer in a stronger role. Basically, I would say, from what we said, we would like this to be totally fossil-free. We liked the Commission's initial proposals, and I would say we are quite happy with the compromise that we now have and can vote on this Monday already. And then, well, you all know how it can be. There will be amendments, and the closer we get to the plenary, the more amendments there will be. But so far, I'm quite confident. And in this sense, I think it's important that we have a broad agreement, because this is really important issues, and they will set the standard how energy should be produced, transported, and also in a way consumed, even if the consumer part is, of course, what's driving all this. So that would be, and so with a flick of a switch, I would say we know how to go into the next chapter on how to transport energy in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erik. I look forward to coming back to you again with some follow-up questions on your introduction there. And it's my pleasure now to invite Dimitrios Chaniotis from ENTSO-E, please, to address us.
Yes. Thank you very much. Good morning to everyone. I hope you can hear me all right, because my connection seems not to be the best this morning. I would like to start by saying that, yes, the 10E is quite a timely initiative from the Commission's side, and quite a good one, by the way. At ENTSO-E, we've been working on these subjects for something like 4 years now, so we're very well acquainted with what is in there and what is the purpose of it, and we can only but salute the initiative. If I start with some background on the most important issue that even the previous speakers touched upon, traditionally, designing the network for electricity was kind of a deterministic approach, where we had a good plan for where the electricity system is going, and then we as infrastructure planners, we had to find the best network that goes with. 10 years ago, this has been slightly enlarged by introducing the European, let's say, dimension into planning the networks. And I think ENTSO-E's creation was a big success in the last 10 years. Nobody's talking today about European system planning, because it is there. What has changed is that we start with the phase out of the transition, let's say, of methane economy to H2 economy, with the advent of new innovative solutions, with the increasing importance of what is happening at the distribution level, with the offshore developments. We realize that in the planning exercise, ENTSO-E and electricity TSOs, we are not alone. I think this is kind of the big message of the 10E, that more coordination is needed under the title that we always put, the nice titles, system integration approach. And we do think that this is the way to go. And we have started already with our gas counterparts a few years ago, already working on that. And we certainly need to enhance it to enlarge it to other sectors as well. This being said, electricity is in the center. The transition will not happen without a higher electrification as being the most efficient solution. And the transition to hydrogen is quite an enormous task, and it has direct implications on the electricity system that we need to capture. The increasing production at the distribution level makes it even more urgent for the electricity system to be able to capture these flexibilities and use them for the safe operation of the system. So this is the way forward. I think the 10E lays the foundations for working within this new context. Nevertheless, you both speakers before me talked about governance and the need of governance and strengthening the roles. We do have, as ENTSO-E, some concerns on this one. It is not a question of maintaining ENTSO-E's role into what's happening today. We are all for strengthening roles. We think it's a bit dangerous, let's say, to changing roles. Every entity comes with its own competencies, its own mission, and its own responsibilities. I think designing the new governance should take into account this. We should make it simple. We should not overcomplicate things. Otherwise, the timelines just do not add up, and the ambition to have some quick resolutions will not materialize. And we do have to be careful. I think one thing that we all have in common is that we do want to enlarge the scope of the planning. We do want the involvement of more stakeholders, of diverse stakeholders, in order to design, let's say, the future energy system, recognizing the roles and responsibilities of each one within it. And maybe in the ensuing result discussion, I can come up with more details if asked on these issues. Thank you so much, Pat.
Thank you very much indeed, Dimitrios. And our final contribution in terms of opening comments, I turn to John Fitzgerald.
Thank you, Pat, and good morning to everybody. I have a couple of slides here which are graphic in nature, and it's really to emphasize the importance of 10E, and we welcome the initiative in 10E. We think it's a step in the right direction. I'm looking back from 2050, from a scenario in 2050 to see, what does, I think we've got to look at the end point and work back rather than incrementing our way to 2050, because the 10E and most of the processes we have are very much cyclical. And I think we're in a transformation here. So it's worthwhile just to look at the end game and to see what a future might look like. And you'll see here, there's two maps of Europe, and the one on the right is one with a lot of interconnection between the different regions and countries of Europe. And it's got about 2,900 gigawatts of generation, largely renewable generation in the offshore, solar, wind, and in the onshore as well. And on the left is one with less infrastructure connecting it. And this is really the nationalistic approach. And I recognize that huge strides have been made in connecting the grids and having a more coordinated approach. And Connecting European Facility has been instrumental in putting interconnection in place. But the trajectory is towards 15%. And if you work back from 2050, where you've got most of our energy coming from the renewable fleet, driven by the weather systems, you can see that that's not going to really work. And I think that's an important view to take, to work back from the future. Next slide, please. Yeah, and you can see, I've looked at China just as an example of what's happening in large continental grids, where they're connecting generation over thousands of kilometers at very high voltages to move large amounts of power to demand centers. And you can see the type of infrastructure that's involved here. These structures are enormous. And I don't think they're the type of structures that will be supported in Europe. Can you go back a slide, please? Yeah, thank you. So I don't believe that infrastructure is appropriate. So obviously there's an innovation gap, and there's a challenge for all the stakeholders to achieve. So I would say on the 10E, that the efficiency first principle is very much supported by current. The anticipatory grid is something that we're going to have to get our heads around, and also innovation towards that. And in terms of the governance, and previous speakers have touched on the governance, I would say that there are national TSOs and utilities, there are gas owners, there are different stakeholders, and what's really needed is while the strengthening of the role of ACER is very welcome, a regulator approves and reviews, and what's really needed is a designer who can take a holistic view, and whose mission will be to decarbonize Europe, and to come up with plans and schemes and to work with all the stakeholders to achieve that. I think that's where we need to go, and we need to go there quicker than you might imagine because of the time it takes to develop infrastructure. So 30 years is very short. It's the life of the infrastructure we've built today will still be here in 30 years. And it takes 10 years, if you're lucky, to develop infrastructure. So that concludes my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that, John. What I'm planning to do is really just to work across the panel, if I may now, with several questions to you each individually, and then to see how we might pick up some of the themes generally. If I could begin with you, Raphael, in listening to you, I thought what was particularly interesting was the way you emphasized that if there's a key change now, it's about a huge emphasis on the cross-border dimension as being critically important. I just wanted to kind of zoom in on that for a minute with you. Please explain the thinking. Why is the cross-border dimension more important for tomorrow than yesterday? And in what way is the cross-border dimension going to be more evident tomorrow than yesterday in terms of the Commission's policy?
Thank you, Pat, for the question, and to give me the opportunity to clarify further on this specific point. Maybe it was not to say that in general, maybe the cross-border becomes more important than the local level. It was more in terms of our 10E framework, because what we see, for example, in the general approach of the Council that was adopted in June, there are some new infrastructure categories introduced, for example, rather local projects on islands, for example, which again, as such, are very important, very important. But what the question this raises is, what can 10E as a cross-border instrument contribute? How can it help for a planning that is required for cross-border infrastructure, where we have already important needs, as also was shown just in other presentations? Should we add other infrastructure categories where we cannot really add a lot, I would say, from a cross-border infrastructure planning point of view, but we should focus on those where there is a significant cross-border impact, which, by the way, does not limit it to only cross-border infrastructure in the physical sense from country A to country B, but includes, of course, also internal lines, for example, or storage projects, which do have a cross-border impact. I think that's the important element here in order to make sense from a cross-border planning perspective. And I mean, I don't know what the Parliament's latest views are on this, but I think this has also been discussed, and we will see what the final position is then in terms of the criteria that are included for determining whether a project is of cross-border relevance.
So in a sense, what you're describing is a 10E framework emphasis on what I might call EU added value. Yes,
absolutely.
Projects, but you're looking at what's the EU added value.
Exactly. And if I may add one comment, Pat, this is then also linking, I mean, 10E is an infrastructure planning tool, but then what many people think of when they think of PCIs is they don't think only of the permitting benefits, for example, and the cross-border cost allocation, to use some technical terms, but also they think of the access to financing, you know, the Connecting Europe facility, which PCIs are eligible to get funding either for studies and works or only studies. And here also it's very important that CEF Energy until 2027, we have around 5 billion, which is not that much if we look at the investment needs, as you also mentioned at the very beginning, and then adding additional potential projects for this financing shrinks the pot overall. And there are other financing instruments for these internal projects, let's say, or local projects.
So in what way then, to link your framework thinking to your governance thinking, you described that there would be an enhanced role for Acer. How does the thinking from the framework that you just described convert into an enhanced role for Acer? In what sense would tomorrow be different to yesterday to do with the role of Acer?
Yes, sorry, I was just not sure whether I was muted. Well, we have provisions. I mean, to give one concrete example, when it comes to the CBA, the cost benefit analysis, where there is in the TNE a procedure on how this methodology is being developed and ultimately approved. Here, we do have a strengthened role for Acer in terms of approving incremental changes to the CBA methodology. Just to give one concrete example on Acer's role, but in general, we do think Acer has, of course, already a very important role and has proven as an important actor in this process. But this is one specific example how we strengthen the role of Acer in this process.
A third element, if I could come to you, it's again from your own introduction, the top-down versus the bottom-up, as you described it. And in particular, we're talking about the development of integrated offshore network development plans, and this requiring member state commitments. And you talked about the sea basin approach. Can you just say at the point we're at now, where are the member state commitments in terms of maturity? Is this just the beginning of a conversation? Are there bids on the table? How do you see it shaping up, allowing for the fact that if we're going to really hit the Fit for 55 targets in the next decade and the even deeper targets by 2050, this is something which needs acceleration and urgency as a critical hallmark?
No, absolutely. And I think in particular, if we look further in the future, so to speak, I mean, we do have, of course, now the NECPs, which we looked into, and where there are also some member states have included some numbers in terms of offshore renewables. But what we see, at least not in all member states, would be sufficient to reach the ambitions we need to reach in the longer time frame work until 2050. And this is one reason why we think bringing member states together, building on the NECPs, but then looking again on what can be reached at a regional basis, and use this as a basis to think how an offshore grid would need to look like to enable the implementation of the agreement by the member states, could be of an extremely added value for investors to see where things will develop. This kind of top-down approach, as I called it, compared to what we have now, where project promoters promote very specific projects as part of the TYNDP, so from the bottom-up approach, so to speak. So we do think this will help to increase the ambition level and hence to ultimately meet our climate and energy objectives.
A last question, if I may, it's in the same line. We have a highly developed, through our TSOs and so on, a highly developed onshore and mature and developing transmission system. We don't really at the moment, I know there are some North Sea projects and so on, we don't really have the offshore grid as such. So with regard to the offshore grid, where is the overall planning concept going to come from to do the joined up writing, as it were? John Fitzgerald talked about a system designer, but really, what is the Commission's thinking about the development of something that doesn't exist? So development from zero, and how that will be developed, integrated, and brought into connection, of course, with all of the land-based transmission systems.
That's a very important point, because we do basically start from scratch to a certain extent, as you say. we do, as part of the TENI logic, so to speak, we do have what we call priority corridors, right? Where we bring the relevant member states per region together, in this case per sea basin, and these regional groups then, which are attached to a priority corridor, would certainly play an important role in designing and building up these vision, if I may say so, for offshore grids. But at the same time, of course, and the ENTSO-E in this case, in particular for the electricity part, would of course still play a central role in this, with the TSOs represented in the ENTSO-E, because they, as you say, have also the knowledge and the capabilities in contributing to this process and ultimately helping designing this offshore grid.
Thank you. Let me turn, if I can, to you, Erik. I'm bound to say I was very impressed listening to you guys stayed up until 3:30 in the morning hammering out amendments. You're beginning to sound a bit like the European Council dealing with the Recovery Fund. Except in your case, I hope it didn't last for 5 days. You've talked about broad agreement. I'm going to ask you to try to summarize for me if you can. And I know, of course, the votes have to take place. You said that the Parliament is happy with what the Commission proposed and broadly accepts the direction and form that the Commission is suggesting. So accepting that, tell me what particular things the Parliament wishes to change or amend that the Commission didn't have, and why are they going for whatever those things are?
Well, I would go into much detail if I would start to point that things out. But I would say we had, first we had the report from the rapporteur, which was quite far away from what the Commission suggested, and quite a lot of the effort, and I would say the end result is to get things back and ending up in very close to a Commission position. And that is, of course, that we should phase out things. We should need and use all, I would say, available means when it comes to get rid of carbon. The best solution is, of course, always to produce it carbon free, but there are also other things that we have discussed, and how we ended up there I can't really go into, because well, some things of these compromises were well, I would risk them if I would go into details right now, because the groups are discussing that for the votes. So
No,
I'm sorry.
Certainly, we don't want to put you in a position where you undermine your own strategy. Let me come in a way then, in a more general way, to a question which I'm sure...
I would say one way I could say we have gone, I would say, a step further when it comes to trying. I would say your former discussion with Raphael, who would own this, who would be the provider. And as I said in my former life as a researcher on the cost benefit, who would be the social planner? And of course, that has been, it's a hard nut to crack. And in that sense, the only natural thing we have seen is that ACER should have, would say, a more prominent role to keep things together, but also involve more stakeholders. ENTSOs and TSOs, they have a really important role, and that will still be in this, but also who will have the helicopter perspective. And one, I would say, difficulty here is, of course, that we are quite dependent on what are the projects proposed. As a commission or as ACER can't really say this should be done. We can only say this is good idea, so this we will put on the PCI lists.
Well, that now is actually very helpful, because if I can stick with that, and I'm not asking you to commit some kind of political hara-kiri on our conversation this morning before you get your votes through Parliament, but you've talked there very interestingly about someone needing to have the helicopter perspective, precisely because it's a massive and highly accelerated transition that we have in mind. Can you give us a sense then of what it is the Parliament would like to see in a concrete way about this helicopter overview and the helicopter pilot?
Well, I'm not, I think not many were in a say that we need a revolution, and we need to create something completely new. So I would say with the bits and pieces we had, we didn't try to add that many new things, but we tried to see how can we use these organizations and authorities to put them together so that someone in the end would get as close as possible to this helicopter view, and also stand for what should be done from the proposals that actually are on the table. And then, of course, again, there are several difficulties, I would say, both with CBA, as I was, well, as a researcher, you try to complicate things, but this is really complicated. For example, when you do CBA, what is the society? Is the society the country? Is it just the energy sector, or is it EU, or is it even a larger entity? Which, of course, it is, because we are connected energy-wise and otherwise to the rest of the world. So these are some things, and try to keep the most important things into this, and also be able to update and get that holistic perspective on both the CBA analysis and the gaps that we have.
Well, that is very interesting. I mean, at a superficial level, those things sound, technical, but in fact, at a substantive level, your question of what is the society, what gains are you attributing value to? Have you hit on that formula? You said, is it a country? Probably, if it's only a country, it's too small. Is it the EU? It's certainly, at least for an EU policy, potentially a right fix. Is it the energy sector only, or is it the large push against climate change? Have you come down, is the Parliament likely to come down on a CBA package that reflects this subtlety? And where does the balance lie then in that parliamentary preference?
Well, the devil is always in the detail. But I wouldn't say that we come down to a CBA package, but I would say we have broadened the perspective, tried to make it easier for projects that have an impact on more than one region, or in this sense, country, to be, to be possible to get on a PCI list. So I would say in that sense, we try to make it easier to have a broader perspective and to take more things into account when you do the PCI priorities.
Erik, a last question. Typically, these relatively complex issues will end up in trilogues between Parliament, Council, and with the engagement of Commission. Do you think a trilogue will be imminent, or is this likely to spend a lot of time before it gets to plenary and gets through Parliament and gets into trilogue?
We will see, because I would say we are already delayed, or at least it took longer than we had anticipated in the first place. And now we have a choice, and we haven't decided that, and that will not be decided until we eventually have a vote on it on Monday. Will we go directly to negotiations from the ITRE, or will we go to the plenary? And I don't know that, and we don't have any suggestions yet, but that's what a formal possibility. But of course, if we can go with a broad majority, regardless if it's from either ITRE or the plenary session, then of course I think we could be quite close to the council in many of the main issues, and then we could perhaps have quite a quick result, which of course is jinxing it, saying it like that, but knock on wood. So my hope is it could be a perhaps a little faster process than we had anticipated. And also, of course, there are big hopes that the quicker and the broader the majorities are, the more we can influence the fifth PCI list, even if it's formally not part of these new legislation.
Thank you, Erik. Dimitrios, if I can turn to you, I was interested in a number of points that you made in your opening remark. One you mentioned, and we've been touching on it now already with the two colleagues, the question of governance, and you said ENTSO-E has concerns about governance. Could I ask you just to develop a little bit, what is the nature of those concerns and why do you have them?
Certainly. And as I said, and it was said by the previous speaker quite nicely, is that we need to change the paradigm and we need to bring together more stakeholders, a wide variety of stakeholders in the planning. And so it does not have the ambition of being the central planner of the energy system, far from that. Yet we do recognize that electricity is in the center. I mean, nothing can happen without having a focus on the electricity system. And therefore, we have made quite large efforts already to bring stakeholders together under this discussion. We are obliged by what we're doing to have this helicopter view. We cannot design the electricity system no more without having this helicopter view. This is our necessity. It is not our preference, it is a necessity for us. And we have been publishing a lot lately, or not so lately, about this need, about the way that ENTSO-E looks forward to that. Now, when you translate that into the governance, into the concrete examples, our concern goes from the practical. The practical is that we see very complex procedures being put in place. Some, if I may say so, absurd directions where deliverables are doubly approved. I think it should be clear who approves what, when, and for what, and who does what, when, and for what purpose. We don't want to mix roles. The regulator has a role of approving. I mean, this is it goes by nature. I mean, would you ever fly a plane that has not been cleared by regulators? No. Would you fly a plane that the wings are designed by regulators? I think the answer is also no. So we should make sure that the roles and responsibilities are well assigned. And that, for me, the fear by reading the regulation and everything that is going around it in the dialogues now makes me think that we need to take a step back and look at it from the fundamentals. Erik mentioned the CBA. The CBA is a very complex animal. And I do recognize where he's coming from, and I kind of agree. If we need to look at more wider aspects, we should bring more people together. But do remember, I mean, complexity is not always good. I always like to end up my words on CBA with something that I heard from a very famous person in cost-benefit analysis. Not all that counts can be counted, and not all that can be counted count. So you do need to have this intimate knowledge of the system before working on a cost-benefit analysis that makes sense. And of course, these things need an approval, either by the regulators, either by the Commission. The process should be clear. The assignment of responsibility should be clear. And the biggest priority for ENTSO-E under whichever governance scheme is to bring various stakeholders together in order to achieve, through coordination, this central, this holistic, this helicopter view in system planning.
Dimitrios, can I ask you? You talked about avoiding excessive complexity. I'll try, maybe at the risk of oversimplifying, a bit of simplexity, which is to say, we know there'll be a lot of offshore wind. We know that hello, Dimitrios.
Yes.
Sorry, I lost you on the sound there.
I can still hear you very well.
Okay, my apologies. So I'm just saying to try a bit of simplexity, if I might, on my side. There's going to be a very complex process to connect up a vast amount of new offshore wind. And today, you know, the nature of the technologies to be deployed and so on are perhaps still only under development and needing innovation and so on. What is your view about the necessity for innovation to achieve these ambitious objectives?
Yeah, I do think innovation, not only for offshore, by the way, I mean, there are many challenges that we're facing in the future, and innovation is kind of the cornerstone of our activities. Within ENTSO-E, we do not innovate as an association, but we do publish an R&D plan that lays forward all the priorities in innovation for the future. Offshore is one of them, and let's say, but we cannot just wait for innovation. I think what the Commission is proposing in the regulation is quite a good step forward, talking about engaging member states into concrete targets, ENTSO-E coming up with the network implications and how this thing is going to stand. We're very happy to see that the link with the onshore planning is maintained, or I think we hope through the ENTSO-E works, this is maintained. In the regulation, innovation seems to have a good place, meaning that there are some initiatives that enable TSOs to employ innovative solutions within their grid planning approaches. Not everything is green, though. I mean, not everything is so optimistic. We do advocate in the face of uncertainty and in the face of, as you say, a lot of technologies that have not proven themselves, is to go to a step-by-step approach. We do not advocate one solution that fits everything. We think that different areas merit different solutions. We should not underestimate that offshore is not only the North Sea. Mediterranean has quite a good potential for offshore with floating platforms or other solutions. The Black Sea also can see a big potential there. So we should be able, through the planning processes of ENTSO-E, to bring together offshore and onshore. We should be able, through a modular and stepwise approach, bring all the pieces together, having this long-term strategic view that the Commission is pushing forward through the 10E. And in the end, how do we say, it's a step-by-step. We need to work on very important things with respect to interoperability of the various solutions and so on, the hybrid projects, how they're going to behave, regulatory issues that need to be addressed. So there are a lot of steps to be taken. I think through our work, if it is maintained as it is in the regulation, through our work in the offshore development plan and the links to the onshore that we're going to establish, we will be in a good way forward.
John Fitzgerald, I'm giving an eye to the timing here, but John, to turn to you, Current, as you've introduced, is a player. It's got a lot of people with different innovations to do with grid and grid development and so on. As a stakeholder, we've had a lot of talk about stakeholder engagement. How do you feel in stakeholder community terms about the extent to which the concerns that you bring forward are listened to or integrated into these complex plans? John, microphone.
So, yeah, I think there's been a lot said, and it's understandable in terms of the effort and the huge effort that we're all going to need to put in, and the concerns, the ambitions, and everything. Like for me, it's about minimizing the green premium, and what can we do to minimize the green premium and work back from the future to work that out. And I agree that a regulator shouldn't be designing the system. I think that's not in their DNA. So I think, but I understand why the step has been taken, because we've got to move to a pan-European view. And we talked about the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. There's very little wind in Northern Europe at the moment. We talked about that. I think we need a holistic view of the system and to start putting that in and bringing all the players along and putting it together. It's very complex, but we have to do more and try more. And as a stakeholder, I'd like to see more opportunities to trial innovation to get there, and more opportunities and facilitation from utilities to trial technologies. We've got to get better at adopting the technologies that we have and bringing through new technologies that can help reduce the green premium. And when I say the green premium, I mean the amount of extra money consumers in industry need to pay for their electricity. And it doesn't have to be a positive. It can be a negative green premium. I've seen what's happened in solar and wind, and it's now the most competitive form of generation. And I think there's a large challenge to make the grid and the system for moving the power around Europe, whatever that might be, as competitive and as good as it's going to need to be for 2050. So as a stakeholder, I think we're going to need another 10E review in 2 years' time and move from sea basins to a pan-European approach that would be more optimal. And we're looking at bigger grids that will move power across continents, and that's going to be required. They'll do it in America, they'll try it in America and in China, and in Europe we have a challenge of our being a confederation of nations. So it's a big challenge for us, but we have to tackle it, or we will future generations will suffer if we don't tackle it, and it's very difficult. And I think all the players are doing a good job, but more needs to be done, and that's how I would say it as a stakeholder.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you very much to everyone on the panel. We're just exactly on the time at 11. I'm not going to try to produce some grand summary, but several things come to my mind. By the way, on the geography, one of the areas we didn't mention that would be certainly wind rich and will be used would be the North Sea, the UK and Norway, because they would be an important part of any evolution of a pan-European grid process, even if those states are not in the European Union itself. Of course, Norway is in the European Economic Area. One of the things I was reaching back, it's just as I'm listening to the debate, I'm not pushing Bill Gates' book. I don't know if any of you have seen it, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. There was one very interesting thing in it, which is why it comes to my mind. He talked about an exercise. This is not a policy, so I'm not confusing the two. An exercise they did to develop a model for the United States of how would you optimize the flows of renewables to have cost competitiveness also as a dimension. And in it, they said if you got the transmission system optimized, that you could produce the same energy needs with 1/3 less investment in actual green electricity generation. Now, the detailed study isn't in his book, but the headline thing is, it does strike me that if Europe is going to go through, as other places will, an unprecedented transformation in terms of scale and speed, that it may require an unprecedented level of examination and analysis to do with the holistic nature of the challenge and to the accelerated need, with a bottom line that is competitive. Anyway, we're at the beginning of something in which this conversation no doubt will go on and mature. I think it's very good today to have the update. It looks relatively optimistic that the 10E package in a sensible way will get through the institutions, and that at least will be a launch pad for the next phase of our conversations, which I greatly look forward to. And thank you all very much indeed for your participation and for your contributions here today. Goodbye and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.